I still remember the day I got the violation notice, crumpled in my mailbox like an insult. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and I was washing my car in my driveway, something I'd done for years. The sun glinted off the soapy water as I scrubbed the dust off my sedan. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. A sharp voice startled me. "That's against HOA regulations," sneered Mrs. Dunham, our ever-watchful HOA president. She was a woman who seemed to thrive on power, always looking for new ways to control the neighborhood. Dressed in her usual beige suit, she clutched her clipboard like it was a weapon. I forced a smile. "I'm just washing my car. Didn't realize that was a crime." She narrowed her eyes behind her thick-rimmed glasses. "It's water runoff. Violates Section 14.3 of the HOA handbook." I didn't even know there was a Section 14.3. I bit back a retort and returned to rinsing the car, hoping she'd leave. But the next day, the violation letter arrived. A $200 fine for washing my own car on my own property. I thought it was a joke. I figured paying the fine would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I was back at it, washing off the spring pollen, and that's when it escalated. This time, I saw Mrs. Dunham's golf cart slow down in front of my house. Her mouth twisted into a frown as she pulled out her phone. I thought she was just taking notes. 15 minutes later, the cops showed up. A patrol car rolled into my driveway, lights flashing. My stomach tightened as I dropped the hose. My neighbors peeked through their blinds like curious birds. 2 officers stepped out, one younger, one older, both looking slightly annoyed. "Sir," the older officer said, "we received a report about water runoff from your driveway." I blinked in disbelief. "Are you serious?" The younger cop sighed. "Yeah, HOA complaint. Just need to confirm you're not flooding the street." I pointed to my driveway, which was barely damp. "It's just car soap. I'm not causing a flood." The older officer shook his head slightly. "Looks fine to me. Sorry for the trouble. These HOA complaints." He trailed off, clearly tired of their nonsense. As the officers left, I locked eyes with Mrs. Dunham across the street. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, a smug smile plastered on her face. That's when I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to own the HOA. I couldn't get the image out of my head. Those flashing police lights in my driveway over something so petty. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. It wasn't just about the fine or the embarrassment. It was about control. Mrs. Dunham and her little group treated the neighborhood like their personal kingdom, and I was done being a pawn. That night, I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat down at my laptop, and began digging into the HOA's bylaws. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd learn the rules better than they did. The documents were dense, pages upon pages of legal jargon. But as I read deeper, something interesting caught my eye. The HOA didn't own their office. The small brick building where they held their monthly meetings and processed all their paperwork. It was rented. I double-checked the county records and felt a spark of excitement. The property owner had recently listed it for sale. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. If I could get my hands on that office, I wouldn't just be pushing back. I'd be in control. The next morning, I called the real estate agent. I expected some corporate owner, but instead, a friendly voice answered the phone. The property belonged to Mr. Callahan, a retired man who had moved to Florida years ago. When I mentioned I was interested in buying the building, he practically sighed in relief. "I'm tired of dealing with their nonsense," he said. "They complain about everything, parking spots, landscaping. If you want it, I'm ready to sell." We scheduled a meeting, and within a week, I stood outside the HOA office building with Mr. Callahan. The place wasn't fancy, just a modest brick structure with faded shutters, but to me, it was power. The deal was straightforward, and I didn't hesitate. I signed the papers on the spot. I owned the HOA's headquarters. The moment the paperwork was official, I sent a formal notice to the HOA board. Effective immediately, their rent was doubling. Mrs. Dunham, of course, called me within hours. "You can't just raise the rent like that," she snapped, her voice unusually shrill over the phone. "Oh, but I can," I said, leaning back in my chair. "And since you love rules so much, you'll appreciate that everything I'm doing is perfectly legal under the lease agreement." I could practically hear her teeth grinding. "You're being unreasonable." I laughed quietly. "Unreasonable? You called the cops on me for washing my car. Consider this a fair response." For the first time, Mrs. Dunham was speechless, but I wasn't done yet. Since I owned the property, I had the right to redefine how it was used, and I had a few ideas that would make life very difficult for her and the HOA. The next morning, I woke up feeling something I hadn't felt in months: power. The HOA had spent so much time making my life miserable, but now the tables had turned. I wasn't just some homeowner stuck under their thumb anymore. I was their landlord. I didn't waste time. With my coffee in hand, I drafted a formal letter outlining the new rental terms. Not only was the rent doubling, but I also added a few special conditions. First, the HOA was now responsible for all maintenance. No more passing landscaping fees to the other homeowners. Second, I limited their office hours to weekdays only. No more weekend meetings to ruin my Saturdays. And third, my favorite, I reserved the right to use the office's main parking lot. I sent the letter via certified mail and even dropped off a copy at the office personally. I could only imagine Mrs. Dunham's face when she read it. Sure enough, by noon, my phone rang. Her name flashed on the screen. I took a deep breath and answered, keeping my voice calm. "You've lost your mind," she said without even greeting me. "You can't enforce these terms." "Actually, I can," I said, pulling up the lease agreement. The original owner never locked in the rent amount, and the maintenance clause was vague. "Everything I'm doing is within my rights. You like following the rules, right?" There was silence on the other end, followed by an irritated sigh. "We'll fight this." I smiled to myself. Good luck. My lawyer's already reviewed it. You should probably focus on raising funds, since your new rent payment is due next month. I hung up before she could respond. For once, I was the one holding the leash. But that wasn't enough. I wanted to make sure they felt the consequences of their petty actions. I decided to play their game. Only better. I knew the HOA had a board meeting coming up soon, so I started preparing. That week, I did some digging through public records and talked to neighbors who had their own grievances. Turns out, I wasn't the only one tired of their nonsense. One homeowner, Mr. Harris, told me how they fined him $500 because his kids' bikes were left outside for an hour. Another neighbor, Ms. Rivera, got fined for planting sunflowers. Apparently, they weren't in harmony with the neighborhood's aesthetic. Everyone I talked to had a story and a burning frustration with the HOA. With every conversation, my plan became clearer. I printed copies of every complaint and even highlighted the most ridiculous ones. I wanted their dirty laundry aired out in public. On the night of the HOA meeting, I arrived early, because I could. After all, I owned the building. I made sure to park right in front of the entrance in the reserved spot, the same one they always used. When Mrs. Dunham arrived, her scowl could have curdled milk. "You can't park there," she barked as she stepped out of her shiny black SUV. I gave her a wide smile. Actually, I can. My building, my rules. I strolled inside and took a seat near the front as the other homeowners filtered in. The room was tense. People were frustrated, and tonight they were ready to let it show. When the meeting started, I raised my hand immediately. "I have a few questions," I said innocently. Mrs. Dunham's eyes narrowed. "This is not the time." "It is," I cut in smoothly. "Since I'm your landlord, I think I'm entitled to a few answers." A few people snickered, but I stayed serious. I held up the stack of complaints. "Why are you fining people for harmless things? Bicycles, sunflowers, washing cars. Are we living in a prison?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but I wasn't done. I dropped the stack of complaints onto the table, the papers fanning out in all their glory. "And if you're going to enforce these rules, shouldn't you at least follow them yourselves?" I continued. "Because from what I see, Mrs. Dunham's rose bushes are 4 inches over the allowed height. Should I issue a fine or—" Her face turned beet red. I leaned back, satisfied. "Just seems fair that the rules apply to everyone, even the people who think they're in charge." I knew I had struck a nerve. People around the room started whispering louder, nodding their heads. For the first time, the power was shifting, and I wasn't going to stop there. The ripple effect from the HOA meeting spread faster than I anticipated. By the next morning, word had spread through the entire neighborhood. The HOA was on thin ice, and everyone knew it. My phone buzzed with messages from neighbors thanking me for standing up to them. People who had once been too scared to speak out were finally finding their voices. But for me, this was only the beginning. I wasn't just satisfied with embarrassing Mrs. Dunham. I wanted to change things permanently. The only way to do that was to dig deeper and find something the HOA couldn't sweep under the rug. I spent the next few days researching everything I could about our HOA. I combed through public records, old newsletters, and legal documents. I wanted to know exactly how much power the HOA had, and more importantly, where they had crossed the line. What I found? It was even worse than I expected. The HOA had been overcharging homeowners for years. They disguised unnecessary fees under vague names like administrative costs and community enhancements. But the kicker? The board had never held a proper financial audit, even though the bylaws required one every 3 years. The last audit on record was from 8 years ago, right before Mrs. Dunham became president. I couldn't believe it. They were breaking their own rules while punishing us for the smallest infractions. And I knew exactly how to use this information. I contacted a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes. After reviewing everything, he confirmed what I suspected. The HOA was operating illegally by neglecting audits and misusing funds. If I wanted to push, I could file a formal complaint with the county. And better yet, I could demand a forensic audit, a deep dive into every cent they had collected and spent. This was the leverage I needed. Armed with evidence, I drafted an official notice of violation and sent it to the HOA board. I didn't stop there. I also sent copies to every homeowner. If Mrs. Dunham thought she could hide behind her authority, I was going to rip that shield away. When the next board meeting rolled around, the room was packed. Homeowners who had never bothered to show up before now filled every chair, and the air buzzed with tension. This wasn't just another boring meeting. Everyone knew something big was about to happen. I stood up the moment the meeting was called to order. "Before we start, I have some concerns to address," I said, holding up the packet of evidence. I found multiple violations committed by this HOA, including financial mismanagement and a complete failure to perform required audits. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Some people gasped. Others whispered to their neighbors. But all eyes were on Mrs. Dunham, whose face had gone pale. "You can't make these accusations without proof," she snapped, trying to maintain control. I smiled and handed out copies of the evidence. "It's all here," I said, my voice calm but firm. "And I've already sent a formal request for a forensic audit. If this board has nothing to hide, there shouldn't be a problem, right?" I could practically feel the ground shifting beneath her. The people she had bullied for years were no longer afraid. A man from the back of the room stood up. "I vote we hold a special election," he said loudly. "We need new leadership, someone who actually cares about this community instead of using it like their personal kingdom." I hadn't expected the motion, but I welcomed it. People cheered in agreement. Within minutes, a petition for a special election was circulating the room, gathering signatures faster than Mrs. Dunham could process what was happening. But I wasn't finished yet. Before the meeting adjourned, I took one last jab. "Oh, and one more thing," I added, holding up a shiny new lease agreement. "Since I'm your landlord, I've also decided to raise your office rent by another 50%, effective immediately." The blood drained from her face. For years, she had held power over everyone. Now, with a single stroke, I had made her pay for it. Literally. And the best part? I wasn't even close to being done. The aftermath of that explosive meeting was everything I had hoped for, and more. Mrs. Dunham had always relied on fear to maintain control, but now, that fear was turning against her. The petition for a special election had spread like wildfire. Within a week, nearly 75% of homeowners had signed it, far more than the required threshold to force a vote. It wasn't just about my car anymore. My actions had given the entire neighborhood the courage to fight back. And Mrs. Dunham? She was scrambling to hold on to her authority. She started sending out passive-aggressive letters to the community, warning that outsiders, meaning me, were trying to undermine the values of the neighborhood. She even tried to discredit me by digging into my background. But there was nothing there. I had lived a clean life, and now I held the power. In the meantime, I kept applying pressure. Since I officially owned the HOA's office space, I began enforcing new policies. If they wanted to use my property, they had to follow my rules. I banned the HOA board from making unannounced inspections, a favorite tactic they used to harass homeowners. I also required monthly financial disclosures, forcing them to reveal how much money they were collecting and where it was going. I knew these changes were driving Mrs. Dunham mad, but I wasn't doing anything illegal. I was just playing by the rules, the same rules they had weaponized against me. But I had one more ace up my sleeve. I had quietly reached out to several disgruntled board members, particularly those Mrs. Dunham had bullied into silence. It didn't take much to get them on my side, just a promise to restore fairness and transparency. By the time the special election approached, half the board had turned against her. The day of the special election finally arrived, and you could feel the tension as homeowners packed into the meeting hall. Normally, these meetings were quiet affairs with only a handful of attendees. But today, everyone showed up. I stood calmly in the back, watching as the HOA's leadership squirmed under the spotlight. Mrs. Dunham tried to put on a brave face, but I could see the cracks forming. She knew what was coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. When it was time to vote, the process was swift and decisive. Ballots were passed around, collected, and counted under the supervision of a neutral third party. No one trusted Mrs. Dunham or her cronies to handle it fairly. It only took 30 minutes to tally the results, but those 30 minutes felt like an eternity. Finally, the head of the voting committee stood and cleared his throat. "By an overwhelming majority," he announced, "Mrs. Dunham is officially removed as HOA president." The room erupted in applause. Some people even stood and cheered. I could see Mrs. Dunham's face, tight with rage, as the reality set in. For years, she had ruled the HOA like a dictator, but now she was nothing. And then came the best part. "And the new HOA president," the announcer continued, "by popular vote, is me." I stepped forward, keeping my face neutral even as adrenaline surged through my veins. The applause grew louder, and more than a few people clapped me on the back as I walked to the front. For the first time in a long time, I was in control, and I wasn't about to waste the opportunity. I looked at Mrs. Dunham, whose face was bright red with anger. "Don't worry," I said quietly as I passed her. "I'll make sure the rules are fair for everyone, including you." She didn't respond. What could she say? She had lost, and she knew it. As I took my seat at the head of the table, I realized just how far I had come. They had called the cops on me for washing my car. Something so petty, so ridiculous. But instead of rolling over, I had fought back. And now, I was sitting in the most powerful seat in the neighborhood. But I wasn't done yet. I had one last plan in mind, a way to make sure no one like Mrs. Dunham could ever abuse their power again. And once it was done, the HOA would never be the same. After the heated HOA meeting, I realized that taking Mrs. Dunham down wouldn't be as easy as I thought. She wasn't going to back off quietly. If anything, my public confrontation had made her even more determined to hold on to her power. But I wasn't done either. I had only just begun. The next morning, I woke up with renewed focus. The ink on the property deed for the HOA's office was barely dry, but I was already planning my next move. Owning the office wasn't just symbolic. It gave me legal control over how the HOA operated on that property, and I intended to make the most of it. I started small. My first action was to send an official notice of new property policies to the HOA board. Since I now owned the land their office sat on, any activities conducted there were subject to my rules. I banned surprise inspections, limited their office hours, and, just to rub a little salt in the wound, tripled their monthly rent. It didn't take long for the backlash to hit. By noon, I had 3 angry emails from Mrs. Dunham and a voicemail that was just her ranting for 2 solid minutes. I let her scream into the void. Nothing she said could undo the fact that I held the keys to her castle. But I wasn't satisfied with just making her uncomfortable. I wanted to strip her of her power entirely. I spent the next few days quietly meeting with other homeowners. Over coffee, on sidewalks, during morning jogs, I started building alliances. Turns out a lot of people in the neighborhood had their own horror stories about the HOA's ridiculous rules. A single mother told me how Mrs. Dunham tried to fine her for leaving her garbage bins out 5 minutes past pickup time. An elderly couple revealed they had to fight a fine because their lawn was too green, which Mrs. Dunham claimed wasn't in harmony with the neighborhood aesthetic. Everyone had a reason to want change. They just needed someone to lead the charge. So I did. I drafted a petition for a special election to remove Mrs. Dunham from her position. According to the HOA bylaws, if 60% of homeowners signed the petition, it would trigger an emergency vote to replace her. It was a long shot, but after everything she had put us through, people were eager to sign. To speed things along, I organized a neighborhood barbecue. What better way to rally support than with free food? I set up grills in my driveway, handed out burgers and flyers, and by the end of the day, my petition was nearly full. Mrs. Dunham tried to intimidate people from signing, but at that point, The tide had turned. She could sense it too. Over the next few days, she fought back hard. Letters from the HOA arrived daily, threatening new fines, questioning the legality of my property acquisition, even trying to ban gatherings in driveways. I ignored it all. The law was on my side, and I wasn't going to back down. But then she crossed the line. One evening, I came home to find a citation taped to my door, an outrageous fine for excessive vehicle washing. Apparently, washing my car twice a week was now a violation. It wasn't about rules anymore. This was personal. That's when I decided to escalate my plan. I called in a favor from an attorney friend of mine. Within days, I had filed an injunction against the HOA, arguing that their targeted harassment violated both my property rights and state housing laws. It was a legal bombshell, and it sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. The board was forced to halt all enforcement actions while the case was under review, stripping Mrs. Dunham of her favorite weapon, fines. At the same time, my petition to remove her reached 80% support, more than enough to trigger a vote. The day the special election was announced, I saw her for the first time in weeks. She was standing outside the HOA office, trying to appear calm, but her face was pale. For once, she wasn't in control. And I wasn't done yet. I had one final play left, one that would ensure Mrs. Dunham would never hold power again. And when the special election day came, I would make sure the entire neighborhood saw just how far she had gone to maintain her grip. The day of the special election arrived with an electric buzz in the neighborhood. It wasn't just about removing Mrs. Dunham. It was about taking back our community from her iron grip. I had spent the last few weeks gathering every piece of evidence of her abuse of power, and today I planned to reveal it all. The meeting was held in the very office I now owned. There was something deeply satisfying about watching Mrs. Dunham sit in a room where I controlled the lights and the locks. Despite her usual cold composure, I could see the tension on her face. She knew what was coming, but she had no idea how much I had prepared. The room was packed with homeowners. For the first time in years, people who had been too afraid to speak out were here, ready to cast their vote. I stood at the front and took a deep breath before stepping up to the podium. This isn't just about washing my car, I began, scanning the room. This is about the years of harassment, unfair fines, and intimidation that many of us have faced. And tonight, you're going to see the truth. I clicked a remote, and a projector lit up the wall behind me. Exhibit A. A copy of the letter where Mrs. Dunham personally approved the towing of my car, without cause. Exhibit B. Records of the increased fines issued under her leadership, over 300% higher than the previous board's average. Exhibit C. A leaked email where she openly called a retired veteran a neighborhood nuisance for having a flagpole in his yard. Murmurs grew louder with each piece of evidence. Homeowners who had once feared retaliation were nodding along, their anger finally boiling to the surface. I delivered the final blow with a financial audit, one that showed Mrs. Dunham had used HOA funds to pay for administrative retreats, which turned out to be luxury spa weekends. She's been using our money while bullying us into submission, I finished, letting the weight of my words hang in the air. But tonight we get to decide whether that continues. The vote was held immediately after my presentation. I stood by the door, watching as one by one my neighbors cast their ballots. Mrs. Dunham sat stiffly in the corner, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. When the final vote was tallied, the result was overwhelming. By a margin of 92%, she was removed from her position. The room erupted into applause. I couldn't help but smile as I met Mrs. Dunham's eyes. There was no more power left for her to cling to. For the first time in years, she was just another resident, bound by the very rules she once weaponized. Her final act of defiance was a dramatic storm out. But it didn't matter. Her reign was over. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. I joined the newly elected board, and together we rewrote the bylaws to make them fair and transparent. Petty fines were abolished, community events returned, and for the first time in a long time, people felt like they belonged. And as for the HOA office, well, I kept it. Every time I walk by and see the door marked with Owner Me, it reminds me that standing up to bullies, no matter how powerful, is always worth it. And the best part? I wash my car whenever I want, right in my driveway. And there's not a thing anyone can do about it. Mrs. Dunham? I heard she put her house up for sale. Apparently, living under the rules of her own creation wasn't as fun when she wasn't the one in charge. Victory had never felt so sweet.